All right, thank you for your patience. Let's go ahead and get started. The executive reports that we're going to be talking about today are ones that Blue Triangle has been putting together in Q1 and into Q2 of this year. We've started coming out with executive reports because we believe that our users need better high-level views of the data of their site. So that's one of the first things that executive reports are good for. It's one of our main prerogatives, in fact. High-level views are going to give you encapsulated information about a monolithic kind of user base on your site. That monolithic base might be all of your traffic. It could also be a particular traffic segment. It could also be just users on desktop devices, for instance. But these high-level views are supposed to give you very quick and easy to read information about those users and how they're experiencing your site. It's all about user experience now. High-level views are really important. There are also new ways of looking at the data and seeing what it's telling you as well. So executive reports, in addition to giving you high-level views, they allow you to see data in new and potentially easier to read ways. In the past, we've relied mostly on trend lines and those kinds of things. You end up with a pretty traditional view of your data set without a lot of exciting possibilities into interpreting that data or understanding a more nuanced version of how users are actually experiencing your site. In this bar graph to the right here, for instance, instead of showing a distribution of users, we're actually showing the sum of performance across multiple pages. So we have a category, a cart, a product, a home, and a search page all stacked on top of each other here. And we can see which pages are more responsible for slower customer journey times across the site. This is going to give you a good idea of a baseline. And it shows you that, maybe this week from March 27th to April 2nd in the middle was maybe not as good of a week for user experience as others. Executive reports are also meant to give you better insights into your data. So new ways of seeing hopefully provide these better insights. And giving you the high-level views allows you to not only access the better insights, but digest them more readily. So we've provided very easy to read rankings, easy to read cards that allow you to compare one time period to another, or one page to another, or one site to another. These better insights will hopefully give you an understanding of how your site is functioning and trending over time. So the first report that we're going to be looking at today is called our Executive KPI Report. And this is one that has been in production for a little while now, probably close to 2 months. We came out with this early in the year due to wanting to give you a better understanding of your site's traffic overall and understanding specifically the real user data that comes to your site. So the real user traffic on your site is going to be all of your real users that come to your site from anywhere in the world. If you're using Blue Triangle's tag, that's pretty much always the case. It's broken out by device type to prevent muddying the data, a lot like pretty much any other place on our portal. And that's because there's such a discrepancy between user experience on a mobile device versus a desktop device. Google does the same thing. We do the same thing in our revenue opportunity reports. So breaking out by device is always a good idea, just because the user experience can differ so vastly. This executive KPI report is also meant to give you an accurate understanding of how well performance targets are being met over time. And this is probably the most important part. KPI, of course, stands for Key Performance Indicator. The KPIs in this case could be performance metrics. And if you're trying to target specific performance goals in order to have better business outcomes on your site, it's useful to be able to trend those over time and figure out where you might be lacking. So seeing the distribution of who's hitting those targets or who's not quite measuring up and how large those user groups are, and then being able to look at that as it changes into the future is going to be very, very valuable information. All right, so our executive KPI report lives in our executive reports tab. That's available here. So if you click on it, it will go to the page. It'll be the exact same view that you just saw. If you've never configured one before, though, there will be an empty state. It just means that the report won't be configured yet. Instead, you'll see a configure new report button in the middle of the screen, and you'll be able to click that to configure a new report. So let's walk through the configuration first. The configuration of this report is pretty straightforward. The only thing we need to do in order to save the configuration is enter a report name. So I can create a report called example, go to the next screen, and I could even save the configuration at this point. Like I don't need to do any more configuration. I'm actually going to name this one test because I just created one named example earlier. The other things that you can do in this general tab, though, besides name your report, are actually choose the time zone for your reporting. So if you're a company located in Tokyo, you could easily choose that time zone. My report interval here is weekly. I can change this to a daily look back and look back at up to 14 days of data. So that's 2 weeks. Or I can do a weekly look back and focus up to 14 weeks. So let me go ahead and focus up to 14 weeks here. The start of my week is going to be a Sunday. And that means that my week is going to measure, like the weekly bucket is going to measure every Sunday through every Saturday night. And the next bucket will be Sunday through Saturday night, and so on and so forth. You can change this to Monday here or any other day of the week. Monday is probably going to be the most common use case for our customers in Europe. So let me switch back to Sunday really quickly. And you'll notice that we have a focus date that already auto-populates at the bottom. That's because this report runs on a rolling time basis. As we move forward into the future, this report will continue to update based on the most recent focus week. So the focus date in this case is the most recent full week of data. So in this case, April 3rd to April 9th, which was last week for me. Let me go ahead to the next page. Here, we are able to configure some of the information regarding the actual metrics that get displayed on the page. So the different metrics that you're able to add at the top are any of the performance metrics that we actually measure in our real user data. There are 6 selected by default, and those are TTI, first contentful paint, largest contentful paint, total blocking time, cumulative layout shift, and first input delay. Let's say I want to make a report that's just the core web vitals, though. I could delete the first input delay, the time to interactive, the first contentful paint, and the total blocking time. And all I need to do then is select, where is it? First input delay. I didn't mean to delete that one, my bad. So these are the 3 metrics that make up the core web vitals, which if you're familiar with Google at all, and some of the tools that they have for measuring things related to SEO, you're probably familiar with the core web vitals. Basically, core web vitals are metrics that they've identified that do a good job of indicating user experience on a site. So I'm going to stick with these for now. The way that Google measures them is at the 75th percentile, or they suggest you to measure them at the 75th percentile for real user data. And that's because of the way CRUX data works. We'll be talking about that in a little bit. All you need to know for now is that this percentile is the statistical method, and I can actually choose which percentile I want to look at. But I can also select between arithmetic mean and geometric mean here and target those instead. Another thing that I can do is change the thresholds. These thresholds are pulled from the defaults in Google Lighthouse. The suggested performance threshold for largest contentful paint between a good and a measurement that needs improvement is 2,520 milliseconds. If I shifted this up to 3,000, it would do that number for their whole report. If I decide that I don't like whatever changes I made, I can easily reset to the Google default values at the right-hand side there. The other thing that you'll need to know about how this part of the page works is that there's a highlighted metric. Your highlighted metric is going to be one that is consistently the focus throughout the entire report. So while part of the report focuses on all 3 metrics together, a lot of the widgets in this report focus on just one KPI. So maybe there's one specific performance target that your company has for one particular metric. In that case, you would want to highlight that particular metric. In this case, I'm going to leave it LCP, but you could do first input delay very easily and just toggle it between your metrics there. The only other parts of this section of the configuration that I need to explain are this bottom part. And this is related to the actual widgets that appear on the page. In this top X pages by volume widget, this is actually configuring the way data displays in that stacked bar graph that I showed you a little bit earlier when I was talking about the values of the executive report. When we were looking at the stacked performance across all the pages, it was showing this widget. So top X pages by volume, means that it will show me my top 5 pages of the site by however many visitors came to that page, and stack them all together so that I get a cumulative performance for that particular path. I can go all the way down to the top 1 page or all the way up to the top 10 pages as well. Let me actually go to the top 10 pages and just see what happens. I'm curious because I already know what happens for the top 5 pages. With our test data here, this custom pages widget is a little bit different. Instead of choosing the pages by volume, this is something that you can actually configure on a case-by-case basis. And it's set using our real user paths. We have some configured already. If you need to create a path, you can easily do that in this create path modal here, which will allow you to associate step names with particular page names that you have configured. And that allows you to see the data across multiple pages of your site for a particular step. So maybe you have 2 different checkout versions, but you want to combine them into one checkout page. You can easily do that here. Let me go ahead and select this demo checkout path for my KPI report configuration, because it goes through the entire user experience of the site, starting at the home page and going all the way through the checkout confirmation. In the next page, this is where we're going to figure out what filters are applying to the rest of the report. So this 75th percentile is for real user data across all the pages of my site so far. If I wanted to limit that 75th percentile to a subset of traffic at all, I could do that here. So a use case might be if you're a product manager and you're managing a particular traffic segment because it's based on region, you could easily select that in the dropdown. In my case, I'm not going to select anything here. I'm just going to go ahead and save the configuration, and it's going to run the report. The report actually runs pretty quickly and gets the data back pretty quickly. But something that you'll note is that my report was called test. This isn't the test report. The page had to kind of reload for it. So in order to get to your report that you've configured, you'll just select the dropdown and then select your test from that list of reports. As far as the rest of the UI at the top goes, this test report was selectable. It's only been generated once, so there's only one in the dropdown. If I went back to this first one again, this has been around the longest, so it has a good number of historical reports associated with it, and I can go ahead and select like an old one and see what the information was at that point in time as well. That's most of the top UI. The only other thing you have to know here is that this wrench icon opens the management screen for all the different reports. We have 8 out of 10 configured for this site right now. This number is determined on a contractual basis. So depending on how many reports you have built into your contract, you'll be able to build that many that run going forward. And I believe these run on a weekly basis. If they're weekly buckets, they'll generate weekly. If the daily bucket, it'll generate daily, that kind of thing. Other stuff at the top that's important to note is that you have your report interval, your focus week for the current report, as well as the look back period overall. And that's just to give you contextual information. You also have all the filters that you have applied. So we can see our statistical method, our time zone, and our beacon type. Remember, we didn't apply any filters in the previous view in the last page of our configuration. So there's nothing more showing right at the top here. The other part at the top is that you can switch between your different devices. So say I really care about my mobile device, I might just want to start there. And you'll notice that this mobile device doesn't look quite as good as the desktop for the same period. Mobile devices seem to be performing a good bit worse. And we can see that the 75th percentile is actually in this poor range for largest contentful paint, Over 33% of our traffic has an experience that's greater than 4.01 seconds, which was that 4,010 milliseconds that was in the configuration. Our focus week is a little bit better than 1 week prior to it. So we can see it improved from 4.62 to 4.58, but that's only a 0.04 second improvement. And then the 75th percentile is only a 0.02 second improvement for the focus week versus this 14th week look back in the bottom bar. So this is just meant to give you a very high level view of your most important metrics on your page. This is the highlighted metric right here. You get the same information in this card as you do in this top cards below. But this top cards below also reports on the additional metrics that we selected for the report. Lastly, the metric definitions at the top here allow you to see what the thresholds are for each of the metrics that you selected, as well as if you're sending this report to an executive at your company or your boss or like some kind of superior or someone who just doesn't have the context that they need in order to understand what largest contentful paint is, you can edit this definition and say that LCP is our important KPI as an example. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to cancel it, but that's something that you could do for this report before you actually go ahead and share it. This top card allows you to see the same information as the highlighted metric top card, but across all your different devices. So we can see largest contentful paint is not doing well. Cumulative layout shift is also kind of struggling. We have 42% of our traffic in mobile users has a poor cumulative layout shift experience. First input delay is the one that we seem to be pretty golden in. Our 76th percentile here is actually in the good range, and that's why it's all green. It's just under the wire though. The traffic distribution is literally 76% here. So the 75th percentile is just like 1 percentile under this limit. But this is definitely the best metric overall for mobile users. Beneath this, we have a roll-up table that presents the same information as in the top cards. This top cards view is nice, but maybe you're more of a tabular kind of person. You can actually see the same data. Something that this does that the top cards doesn't do for you though is actually calculates the percent change between each of these values. So I can see my focus week here, as well as the percent change versus the week prior and the percent change versus all 14 weeks. It hasn't really changed substantially. The one that has changed substantially versus this 14-week look back is this cumulative layout shift. It has increased in its score by 8.4%. So this is the most substantial change. And this says to me that maybe something changed on the site where things are shifting around more than they were before. This is the kind of thing that you'll be able to look into further down the page if you've selected cumulative layout shift as your metric. Maybe this isn't important to me, or maybe I just want to free up some space on the page. Regardless, I can move the edges of the widgets around to make the view smaller. I can also move the widgets around and reorder them on the page. And then the last thing that I can do here is actually hide widgets if I choose to do so. Maybe I just don't think the table view is very useful. So let me go ahead and hide this widget. You'll notice that when I hide the widget, it goes into this right-hand side area where I can just add it back into the page later. It doesn't delete it, it just hides it. And in order to hide this sidebar view, you just click the minus button. The plus button will expand it again. If I want that graph back, I can either go into the side view and drag it back onto the page, which is right there, or I can just click reset widgets, and that's going to reset all the widgets that are available in the report. Let me go ahead and go back because it reloaded everything again. Let me go ahead and go back to that test report and scroll down. So we're back to where we were before. The next two graphs below the table are going to give you a trended view over time of your different metrics. You can kind of see and get context for the 14-week period versus the previous week and all that. We can see largest contentful paint is pretty consistent over time. I'm not worried about it. The reason that this is in a different graph is because the scale is very, very different here. We have a measure in seconds versus measures in milliseconds. And these are under 100 milliseconds. If they were displayed on the same graph, they would be basically next to the x-axis at the very bottom. So that's why they're in different trend graphs here. The other thing important to note is that the milliseconds here for first input delay are only valid for first input delay. Cumulative layout shift is a performance score, not a performance timing. If we recall, first input delay was the one that has been getting better over time. We see it started out to the left side of the graph here at 40 milliseconds, close to the beginning of our look back period. To the right side, we're down to 24. So we've almost halved it, which is pretty good in this context. For cumulative layout shift, we're a little bit more scattered and kind of all over the place. We're at a pretty high level right now, but in the past, we have been at lower levels of cumulative layout shift, especially towards the beginning of the period. And it looks like there was a change that took effect for 2 weeks previous to the last 3 weeks. So that's kind of probably why we see such a big change in the cumulative layout shift here. When we're looking at the desktop now again instead of mobile. So if I switch back to mobile, there we go. It's actually the opposite in this case, which is kind of interesting. So mobile users had worse cumulative layout shift when desktop users got better, which is very intriguing. As far as the stacked bar graphs underneath go, the top X pages graph is to the left. The real user path that I configured is to the right. This real user path is going to be the one that you configure and create the page names for and link them to the different steps of your journey. You can also correlate this with conversion rates over time. Same with the one on the left, but this one shows by default. And this allows you to kind of see and set a baseline for a standard user journey through your site. The one on the left can also be useful depending on your site's configuration. In this case, you'll need to make note that largest contentful paint isn't necessarily available on all kinds of pages. So virtual turns aren't going to collect the same kinds of performance metrics that full page loads will. So you'll notice that we have PDP, largest contentful paint measurements for every single week, but we don't have any measurements for add to bag VT. So again, if I wanted to hide this, I could easily do that by just clicking hide widget. And then in this case, I'm gonna make this chart a little bit bigger because maybe I want to see more of the difference between the pages. And if I'm having a hard time reading exactly what is becoming volatile, to me, it looks like this product detail page potentially, as well as the checkout review page looks to be pretty volatile as well. If I can't just tell that by looking at the bar graphs, something that I can easily do is go into the little hamburger menu at the top right of the graph and toggle the data labels on. This will allow me to see the data on a bar by bar basis for each of the pages in this stacked view. The last couple of views on this page are your traffic distribution over time and then your aggregate trend that corresponds to that. So again, we have a pretty terrible largest contentful paint. Consistently over 30% of our mobile traffic is in this poor range of performance for LCP. That means our 75th percentile is definitely going to be in the red. And that's why all the bars to the right are in the red. If we had gone from 75th percentile in the yellow to 70th percentile in the red, it would change color halfway through this. So that's the context here. The 75th percentile just reports on the exact performance number at the 75th percentile. The left-hand graph is just meant to give you a distribution of your traffic over time as you get closer to the present. These are the different widgets available to you in the Executive KPI report. Hopefully they give you context for distributions within a particular KPI and across multiple KPIs in some cases. Hopefully it also gives you context into what you might need to target for improvement, as well as how consistent your performance is over time, whether improvements are being made, and so on and so forth. CRUX data is not something that Blue Triangle collects. And we're going to talk about what it isn't first, because I think that can be really helpful in understanding what it is. So CRUX data is not collected by Blue Triangle, and that's the most important part of this piece. It's also not accessible historically. So you can't go back and try to get the data for a particular URL that happened in the past. Google has access to that information. They don't make it publicly available. So that's the important part here. It also doesn't represent individual users. A CRUX data point is not going to be representative of a single user in a Chrome browser, and it does not include field data for users outside of Chrome browsers. What does this mean? Field data is essentially Google's term for data that is collected in an organic way with real user traffic. The other important part of this, though, is that it's not only just field data in a Chrome browser, it's also field data in a Chrome browser where the Chrome user hasn't opted out of data collection. So CRUX data is made up of a subset of Chrome users that are opted into data collection for this use. We know so far that it's basically generated by Google Chrome because Chrome is collecting the aggregate information about these users in Chrome browsers who have opted into data collection. It's not accessible to us historically. So if we try to go and measure a URL, we can't pull the data from the API for a date back in 2020, for instance, but we can do it for today. We also can't do it for yesterday, but we can do it for today. And the last important part to understand about what CRUX isn't is that it doesn't include every performance metric. There are only certain performance metrics that CRUX includes. Let's talk about what CRUX is. CRUX stands for the Chrome User Experience Report, or CRUX. This report, a lot like the KPI Executive Report, is split between mobile and desktop users because the experience is so different between those two subgroups. Field data, again, is collected by Chrome browsers for Google Chrome from those users who are opted into data collection. So a direct quote from their site talking about the Chrome UX report is that it's a public data set of real user experience data on millions of websites. And that's because Chrome is collecting this on pretty much any website that a Chrome user goes to when they're using a Chrome browser. So even though Blue Triangle has very complete information on your site, if we have a tag on your site, then we have really good insight into your data. What we don't have good insight into is the performance data across all of your competitor sites. There's no way we can do that or legally provide that information. Google just allows you to access this because it's available. The end users basically have opted into it, quote unquote, for the collection and aggregation purposes. This aggregated and anonymized data represents a collective experience. Each CRUX data point, so a measurement pulled from the CRUX API, is the 75th percentile of performance, but that CRUX data point represents the 75th percentile for all users to a particular URL over the past 28 days. So it's a very nuanced kind of thing. If I pull the data for today and I pull the data for like when tomorrow comes, if I pull the data for tomorrow, it's not going to be reporting on the 75th percentile of today and tomorrow. It's not a day over day change. It will be reporting on the previous 28 days from the day that I pulled the report. It's basically, if you compare the data pulled today versus the data pulled tomorrow, it's a rolling 75th percentile that will basically update as we go forward in time. And it will take a while because of that for significant performance changes to get picked up into CRUX data. It's only after a certain amount of time has passed that the changes become very noticeable. The other thing that CRUX is a collection of 4 performance metrics in particular. So it's aggregated, anonymized, collective experience data for 4 different performance metrics. And those are first contentful paint, which is not a core web vital, and then LCP, CLS, and FID, which are all core web vitals. So we've talked about core web vitals briefly. These are just the ones that Google has identified as important for website ranking. First contentful paint is not on that list of core web vitals, but they've included it in CRUX for whatever reason. So you're actually able to include it on the CRUX competitive report that we're building out right now. Let's talk about use cases of the Executive CRUX competitive report. And then I'll walk you through really quickly the configuration and how to use the different parts of the page. So the Executive CRUX competitive report is meant to provide insight into Google's numbers for search ranking optimization. And that's probably the biggest reason that people use CRUX data to begin with. They want to know about their search engine optimization. They want to know how they are going to improve their site in order to move up in the rankings. And they might run multiple URLs from their competitors to sort of get a feel for where they are versus their competitors. But what CRUX doesn't really enable you to do easily is compare between your site and other sites. So in addition to providing those numbers for optimization and allowing you to trend those numbers across key URLs of your site over time in order to see if your targets are being met. You can also compare yourself and your targets to your competitors using that public-facing API data that we're pulling for you. So we're not at the Q&A yet. Let me go ahead and share my browser again, and we will go over not the actual live report because it hasn't been built yet. This is a mock-up that I created that shows the way the Executive Competitive CRUX report will look. This CRUX Competitive Report is going to be a lot like the UI of the KPI report that we just covered. You have the same wrench icon that manages the different reports. You have the same configure report button. Even the empty state looks very similar. Just take my word on that part. And if we click configure the new report in the middle here, it's going to pop up a modal almost exactly like the one we went through for the KPI configuration. The difference is that this is going to require a little bit more configuration. For the KPI report, because it's blue triangle data, a lot of that configuration has already been done for you. You don't need to name pages or figure anything out. It's just there and it is what it is. For the CRUX Competitive Report, you have to configure everything. So that's the main difference. The fields that will be required in this first general page are going to be a report name as well as a look back period. So the report name, I could just enter test again. The time zone is actually going to be read only. And the reason for that is because Google collects it at an unknown time every day and it gets pulled automatically from the API at a specific time of day. So we're just calling it GMT UTC in general. The look back period here is 4 weeks. I believe we're doing 8 weeks by default. Sorry, I might be doing 4 weeks by default. I can't remember the exact default period. But the look back period could be up to 2 years. Basically, we'll want you to be able to look as far back into the past as you can with this. One thing you'll need to keep in mind is that when you first configure the report, it might be a good idea to keep the look back period relatively small. The reason for this is that you can always go back into the report configuration and change this look back period. The second thing to keep in mind is that because we're not able to access historical CRUX data, when you first create this report, this look back period won't populate with anything. We will be getting the data for the first report the first day that you configure it. So if you're looking at a 4-week look back period, you're only going to have 1 data point the first day, 2 data points the second, and that's a far cry from the 28 data points needed to configure a 4-week look back. The last thing that I can do here is actually exclude FCP from the report since it's not a core web vital. So you can toggle that on or off. I'm going to leave it off and then go to the next configuration page. In this next configuration called Sites and Pages, we actually have 2 different options available to us. Essentially, we can create up to 5 different site names and 5 different page names. And these are going to be the way the data gets displayed in the report. The data display is going to be based on whatever you call the sites here and whatever you call the pages here. So maybe you want to say it's competitor 1, competitor 2, and leave it kind of anonymized. You could also name names. You can call them whatever you want, to be honest with you. You could even compare multiple of your own properties here. So if I click the plus button and just pretend I clicked it 5 times, you'll notice I can't add any additional site name fields. It's a maximum of 5. Same with page name, but there are only 2 added right now, so it still has the plus sign available to you. And in order for us to be able to go to the next configuration step, you have to make sure every field is filled out. The last thing that you can do here is a lot like highlighting the metric in the KPI report. This is just favoriting the site name or page name though. And what this will do is it will highlight that site name or page name in the ranking. So let me go ahead and highlight site 3 in this case. You'll notice that this field still isn't filled out, so the next button is still disabled. If I go ahead and fast forward into the future where I filled it out and then added a couple of other page names, the next button is now enabled because all the fields are filled in. You don't have to favorite a page name or site name, by the way. It might just be helpful if you're trying to compare yourself to competitors. And then the last part of this configuration is configuring the URLs that you want to measure for this CRUX data. So each site and page name combination has a corresponding URL. In this case, I filled out the origin domain for each of the sites. You'd have to fill out all of the different URLs in order to be able to save the configuration at the end. So if we click Save Configuration, it should just close it. This is an example of the modal and the way the management screen will look after you've configured a couple of reports, though. And it's just to give you an idea, it looks exactly like the KPI report management as well. This is just CRUX Competitive Reports instead. So as far as the way the report itself looks, the UI is very much similar to the KPI report. We have pretty much all the same top UI with the wrench icon allowing you to enter that management screen. This field allows you to view historical reports, and then you can toggle between reports with the report dropdown. This About CRUX button at the top right is going to be useful in the future too. It's going to go over pretty much in detail all of the data that I covered when I was talking about what CRUX was and wasn't. And that's just to provide some additional context on the page. There are also some contextual callouts at different points on the page so that you understand exactly what it is you're looking at and what each CRUX data point represents. Because it can be confusing, it's not blue triangle data, and we just want to make sure what is being represented is very, very clear. As far as other functionality on the page, you can toggle between different device types. You can also toggle which group by you do. So if you do a group by page, that means you'll have pages appear in the tabs to the right for this top card section. And then also your pages will appear on the x-axis in the bar graphs below. Lastly, in the last view here, where you have a trended look back period, instead of just viewing one most recent CRUX report date, you'll be able to select the page type from the dropdown. If you group by site, everywhere that page name appears here ends up being swapped out with site. So you end up ranking by page name instead of by site name, in case that makes it more clear to put it that way. So let me quickly go over the actual cards at the top of the page. The overall CRUX rank by site is going to be done based on a rank by metric to start. So each metric has an even amount of weight right now. We haven't skewed the weighting towards any one individual metric or other because Google doesn't really provide a lot of clarity into which metrics are the most important for its site ranking. So we just rank them all evenly at this point in time. And this is another reason why you might want to exclude FCP, because this is not a metric that Google has identified as being important as a core web vital. Basically, you have your metrics across all the different sites and a rank for each site within that metric. So we can see site 4 came in first place here, site 3 came in second, site 1 came in third, site 2 came in fourth, and site 5 came in fifth. I know it's kind of confusing to listen to. If I wanted to understand how those rankings across that metric happened, you can click the Show Detail button. And when you hover over the help icons, it will give you more contextual information about how the different scores are calculated and what goes into each of them. Basically, the metric rank is going to be based on a combination of threshold score and performance score. If you have all your URLs that you're measuring across the site, if you have one URL that is good in terms of the 75th percentile, it's in the green, then that will earn you 5 points for this threshold score. If you have a yellow site URL, that earns you 3 points. So that's one needing improvement. And then if you have one that's 75th percentile is in poor, so it's red, then that's only worth 1 point. So this site 1 is the total sum of those scores across all the pages that you're measuring for the report. If two sites are tied, like site 1 and site 2 both have 19 here, and then site 4 and site 3 both have 21, because they all got maybe the same numbers of green, yellow, and red site or pages, then you go by the performance score. This performance score is a cumulative score for the individual metric. So in this case, FCP at the 75th percentile across all the pages totaled 11.0 seconds when you added it up. Site 2 was 11.5, and that's why site 1 ranks a little bit higher than site 2 in this case. So hopefully that gives you some information and context about how that exactly works. The rest of the functionality on this page is a little bit more straightforward. Instead of going by rankings here, it shows you what the rankings are by metric and by page. So this top level card gives you the ranking for your site compared to the other sites. And you'll notice that the highlighted site, site 3, is here. So you can see where we sort of didn't stack up quite well versus where we really shined. And that's just for the success page. If we wanted to look at all pages, we'd be able to see ourselves compared across all the different pages of the site for all the different sites for each metric. The key is at the top here about what each individual thing means. You'll notice FCP doesn't have the Core Web Vital designation beside it. Let's go back to the success. And as we move down, you're going to get into the bar graphs, which allows you to compare PDP pages between different sites, cart pages between different sites, and sort of figure out who stacks up where. Something that you can do here is actually toggle on a threshold for all the different graphs, and that will allow you to see who's in the good range. Anything below the yellow is in the good. Anything between the yellow and red dotted lines needs improvement, and then anything above the red dotted line is considered poor performance. You can see that the success page across all the different sites needs to be worked on pretty substantially. Same with category. Versus the cart page, we have 3 different sites that are in the yellow here, and then 2 that are in the green. The last thing that you'll need to know about on this page is that this CRUX data trend look back is going to be populated as this report continues to generate in the future over time. As we collect data for all the URLs that are being measured in the report, that gets added into a table, and we are able to trend them into the past. This isn't able to be populated when we first start running the report because, again, the API that we're getting the data from does not have historical data accessible to us. Something that you'll be able to do here is select your page type if you've sorted by page name. If you're grouping by site, you can select by site here. You can also select which metric you want to look at in the dropdown. So that is the report overall. All right, thank you so much for joining. I haven't had any questions come in, so I hope you have a great rest of your day.